Good morning, everybody. Welcome to another stream with the Rock Island Sound and the Westchester Children's Museum. My name is Rachel, and I am an instructor at Rock Island Sound, teaching voice, guitar, piano. And if you haven't tuned into any of my streams thus far, I've been talking about, and we've been working through the decades talking about American popular music history. And we've gotten pretty far. So if any of this is interesting to you, I want you to keep watching. Um, we started out talking about the 1930s when we first began, and now we're at the early 2000s, the year 2000 to 2010. And the first thing I want to talk about before we jump into the artists of that decade that we're going to discuss and study for a bit is how music has changed. When you think back to what we were learning when we were focusing on the 60s and 70s, and then you think to the early 2000s, there's a lot that's happened. And with music, particularly, the way that we produce music changed so much in this time. The way that you promote music changed so much in this time. In the 60s and 70s, there was no MTV, there was no electronic production. But in the early 2000s, the internet was starting to come to fruition. And that totally changed the life of the artist, not only in how you're able to share your music and get it passed around the world, but also in just how you're physically able to listen to it. Now, a lot of us, most of us, listen to music by streaming it on streaming platforms like Spotify, Apple Music, YouTube, SoundCloud. Without those didn't exist before the internet, how could they? But in the early 2000s, people started to be able to buy and stream music on their computers online. And this completely changed the industry, especially because people were able to download music illegally. And this was very confusing for a lot of artists because they'd never seen this before, and it was frustrating at the beginning, and there was almost no way to control it. But as internet and technology advances, so are the people using it. They're going to get smarter. They're going to figure out how to manipulate new things, and that's exactly what happened with downloading songs online. So it's an interesting time period for music. A lot of people say that the early 2000s and even some of the late 90s is a pretty poor example of what good music would be. A lot of people don't like it, but in any decade or section of decades that people classify as bad, there's always going to be artists that are outliers. An outlier just means somebody who's different from the rest. And as we know, there are usually a lot of artists that, or a few artists that really define the decade and define the time period. And so today, we are going to talk about a few of them that are all very different. And that's sort of the fun thing about the early 2000s is that unlike the 90s where it was a big rush of pop punk and grunge and just pop with different bands and groups, girl groups and guy groups, the early 2000s is a hodgepodge of different genres. And the first artist that we're going to start talking about is one of my absolute favorites, Alicia Keys. So the early 2000s was when she got her start, and from from 2002 past that, she'd really broken through into the mainstream. She started her career in the 90s, but she hadn't really broken through the mainstream, and there was a way that she broke through the mainstream. When we were talking about the 80s a few weeks ago, we talked about the absolute legend Whitney Houston, and I don't know if I ever mentioned it, but Whitney Houston was not discovered per se, but essentially discovered by this man who actually is what my college program was named after, Clive Davis. And so he was an A&R man, meaning that he would essentially find new talent and bring it to his company, his label, and get them signed. And then after he sort of moved on from that, he started his own label. And Alicia Keys was one of the first huge artists that Clive Davis signed to his label. And this was the really this was the turning point her in her life and in her career, um, when she got signed in late 1998 to Arista Records with Clive Davis. And she wanted, and Davis gave her the creative freedom and control that she wanted, which was extremely important to her. And he encouraged her to be herself. And while her career had started in the 90s, there was a reason it wasn't working, and it's because the people she had been working with weren't encouraging her to be herself. Clive Davis said that he could see her instincts and her talent without um, feeling like he needed to push her in one direction. And he really wanted her to just find her sound. She played small shows across America in between 1999 and 2002. Um, and people thought that, Clive Davis thought that maybe she wasn't going to be as successful on pop radio because she was more R&B, but she was an incredibly compelling and hypnotic performer, one of the best he'd ever experienced in person. So he had a lot of faith that she would do well. And then she performed on The Tonight Show to promote her upcoming EP and album, and this is sort of when she really took off. People really, really enjoyed this, and her first album received 6 Grammy nominations. Really, fantastic. And then from there, she was extremely successful. And in her next album is when a lot of her most famous songs came to light, and just like the one we're going to listen to a little clip of right now. Some people live just for the fame. Some people live for the power. Some people live just to play the game. That song is called If I Ain't Got You. It's absolutely great. And the thing that's also incredibly admirable about Alicia Keys is that she's still working. She's still creating music. She has her own plugin on a lot of production softwares that have her own special piano plugin because people know her as an incredibly good pianist who would sing and play piano at the same time. Um, she's an activist. She's really everything that you would want in a powerful black woman in this industry, and it's incredibly admirable. And I love Alicia Keys, and she got her start as a normal kid in 1998, and then they took the early 2000s by storm, and it's very impressive, in my opinion. So I highly recommend that you go listen to some more stuff of hers. As I say every stream, there's so much more information that we could talk about, but we can't fit it all into 20 minutes. So I think that if you really want to understand how all of these artists sound, what their music is like, you have to go listen on your own as well. Um, Next, we're going to talk about a band. And then this band, I want to know if anybody has any guesses for popular bands in the early 2000s. Rock, pop, rock, alternative, whatever you want to call it. This band was actually originally part of the late 80s, early 90s punk scene, but that wasn't very successful for them. And they kept trying, but as we got to like 2004, they really took off with their album American Idiot. Does that give anybody an idea of who we're talking about? So it's going to be this awesome band called Green Day. Green Day definitely helped define the early 2000s sound on a different wave. You know, Alicia Keys was a lot more pop, a lot more R&B, and Green Day is a lot more rock, a lot more alternative. So the group started in California, and like I said, they started in the punk scene where they didn't have much success. Um, and they had a few records that they released in 1994 and 1998 that, you know, some people enjoyed, but it wasn't, they didn't take off in any way. They were not mainstream yet. The whole world didn't know them. But when they finally got a release on MTV in 1994 for one of their songs, that's when they started to get some traction. And then in 1995, their first album that they worked on with a major record label. There's a big difference between creating an album in your home, in your in your basement, and creating it in the studio, getting a loan from a producer and being able to do that. So in 1995, they actually won their first Grammy for Best Alternative Album. And this was definitely helped and fueled by the fact that their MTV music video, they that really took off, and they were nominated for 9 MTV Music Video Awards. But their commercial success really didn't start until 2002. Um, they released more singles and then started actually touring a lot with some different groups. And then they released their album American Idiot. And like I said, this was the album that took them to mainstream commercial success. Um, they had a record label at the time with this place called Adrenaline Records, and they collaborated with a variety of people on the album to make it as successful as it could get. And it was supposed to be a punk rock opera. And it was supposed to depict and focus on American life under the control of an American idiot. And it's a really interesting concept when you think about it that way. And it also was then taken as a form of protest art because it was released 2 months before President George W. Bush was reelected in 2004. Um, and it won the 2005 Grammy for Best Rock Album. And protest songs and protest art have always existed, but a lot of people thought that that had to exist in the folk music scene and nowhere else. And Green Day definitely did a good job of changing that narrative and saying, we're a punk alternative band, but we're also going to have a very political tone to our work and try to make a statement. And that's not to say that other punk artists didn't do that, because they definitely did, but Green Day was a little bit more commercial and a little bit more mainstream at this point. They were not underground. So they were taking somewhat of a risk, but all of America seemed to really resonate with the project. And so it ended up being a success. And the cool thing about Green Day as well is that they then created and kept, you know, making music and art for years and years. They are still together, and they're still doing covers, doing original songs. They've had a really good run. Um, and that's all due to the fact that they really got that success in 2003. If they hadn't written that punk rock opera, I don't know where they would have been. Um, but they also helped for a lot of Broadway shows. They got a Broadway show for their album as well. There was a Broadway show called American Idiot. So they had a really interesting career once they released that. Interesting because their sound changed a lot from then to 2004 to 2005, 2006. You know, they have a song that a lot of people know called Wake Me Up When September Ends that came out, I believe, in around 2007 or 8. And that song was one of the first ones that I'd heard from them when I was, you know, very young. And it was a lot more of a just a soft rock pop, whereas their early stuff was still very heavily influenced by the punk scene. And you can really see that when listening to Basket Case. But they never let go of those influences because that's how they started. They just incorporated different things to sort of make themselves more fully formed. And the last group we're going to talk about is one other band. And if you thought Green Day was punk and rock, this group sort of takes the cake for that. Um, they are also, still creating music, but they did take a long break. And they're actually from New Jersey. They're from close by to where I am now in New York. Um, and this is a group that got mainstream success. They had released some other albums in 2002, 2004, but their mainstream success came in 2006 with their concept album, The Black Parade. Does anyone have any, does that give anybody an idea of who we're talking about? I hope so. Um, so this is a punk rock band called My Chemical Romance, and they also heavily defined the early 2000s. And like I said, there was so much dissonance, there was so much happening in this time period that the music was reflecting that. All of the different genres were very clearly and distinctly their own. And there are obviously a bunch of other artists in different genres. Um, Sarah McLachlan, different things, people, singer-songwriters, that really also defined this decade, but we can't talk about all of them. So My Chemical Romance um, was released their album The Black Parade in 2006, and it got extremely good reviews among music critics, and then it was certified platinum and all of the things that can happen when you're hitting a lot of success. um, they actually broke up in 2013 and then got back together in 2019, which is really interesting. But the band was formed by their frontman, their singer, Gerard Way, in New Jersey in 2001. And they had said that they witnessed the fall of the World Trade Center on 9/11, which is very, very sad. But actually, it inspired them to start a band. They wanted to live life to its fullest extent, they said. And so they wrote a lot of songs about that tragedy at the beginning. And then Gerard, and his drummer, Matt, had to recruit a bunch of other people to join the band to make it a real band. And like I said, they started working on a lot of different things, trying to get signed to different record labels, and they did get signed to Eyeball Records. But their stuff hadn't really broken through. They were not commercial. They were not really doing that well in the commercial scene. They were playing really small shows. They were still getting all of their money from their little shows. But they started getting their initial fan base through MySpace. And MySpace was a social media, it was a social network similar to Facebook. It was the first Facebook, a lot of people would say, because it was older. It began before, it was not as user friendly. Um, but a lot of punk artists actually got their start on MySpace because people, for the first time, were able to go onto a computer and go online and reach a community of other people who were interested in the same things as them. And so this really helped a lot of music scenes, but particularly the punk scene, because punk has always been something that was edgy and ruffled the edges of people and made people uncomfortable. And so for a lot of punk fans, they didn't have other punk fans around them. So they would go to MySpace and to the computer to connect with other people and other individuals who thought like them and listened to the music that they listened to. So My Chemical Romance actually got their first fan base through MySpace, and I think that's really interesting because it really goes to show the power of social media even in 2004. So from 2003 to 2006, they signed with Reprise Records. They went on a tour, they had some album releases, but none of it went so commercial. None of it was so successful. And it wasn't until 2006 when their concept album, The Black Parade, was released. And they had a lot of reference to David Bowie, not necessarily in the genre that they were doing, but more in the lyrics and the concept album aspect. Um, and their song "Welcome to the Black Parade" is probably their most famous song, and it was released on as a single on September 11th, 2006, and it instantly skyrocketed them to fame more than they'd ever known before. Every single news outlet was talking about them. People were confused in the same way that older people were confused when the Beatles got big in the 60s. Older people were confused, didn't want their kids really listening to My Chemical Romance, even though there was nothing actually inappropriate in the content of the words they were saying, but it was the storylines and the general sound of the music that people were surprised by, startled by, not particularly comfortable with. And the news outlet Daily Mail actually criticized them publicly, saying that they attracted a cult, that their fan base was very cultish, meaning that they thought blindly and didn't think for themselves. That's sort of what people mean when they say that something is cultish. It means that the fans are blindly dedicated to the band without actually holding them accountable for things. Um, but they sort of just said, well, if you think that, good for you. Like, bye, essentially. Um, like, we're not going to listen. And the Daily Mail doubled down, defended their position, said that this was the best thing for public interest to warn them. Um, and that was pretty upsetting for the band, but they didn't really let it show that they were upset by that. But it was the first, public issue that people had with them. But they kept releasing music, and they sort of took that statement and turned it all around, because their fan base ended up being so loyal and not in a bad way, in a way that was a community for people. Um, and to this day, there are still a lot of people who really, really remember that My Chemical Romance was the first group that spoke to them and helped them grow emotionally. And a lot of punk bands do that because they don't skate around the hard stuff. They don't skate around the sad stuff, the depressing stuff. They talk about it, they sing about it, and they make music about it because that's the only way to get through it. And they do so in a way, in a sound that is so upbeat, and it's a it's a contradicting sound to lyrics, and I think that's one of the most interesting things a group can do. So we're gonna just listen to a second. He said, will you defeat them, your demons, and all the non-believers, the plans that they have made, because one day. So if you want to listen to the whole album all the way through, then you get the full concept album. And so when somebody says they're writing a concept album, that means that all the songs belong together, and that when you listen to them for the first time, you should listen to them all the way through. Um, yeah, so that's all we're gonna talk about for today. Of course, like I said, there are so many other artists who helped define this decade. But if I had to pick three, I sort of thought that those were the best three. Um, the early 2000s was a time of bands, as all decades are, but I felt as though I was focusing a lot more on solo artists throughout these streams, and I wanted to give some bands some recognition in the early 2000s. So if you enjoyed this, I encourage you to tune in on Friday, because I'm going to be doing the 2010s, which is 2010 to now. And I'm really excited for that, because that's obviously the music that we know, people my age, people younger than me, that we know as most familiar to our hearts and to our ears, because it's what we've lived with. So if you're interested in that and all of the icons of the past decade, we're going to really be talking about that on Friday. Make sure to tune in with Noah tomorrow to learn about trumpet and drums, and make sure to sign up for a lesson with me if you want to learn how to sing, how to play guitar, play piano. So you can do that through Rock Island Sound, giving them a call or going onto their website, anything like that. So have a wonderful Tuesday, everybody. Listen to some music, and I will talk to you all on Friday. Bye.